This week on The Sceptic. I speak to Jordan Knight, Director of Migration Watch Australia, on Australia's immigration problems and the similarities of the politics of this crucial issue across the Anglosphere.
People feel like they've been put second to these more sort of fantasies and progressive ideals. I think for a long time in Australia, we had this very sort of one world, one people sentiment, and that we're all the same and things like that. And it's only really in the last few years of mass immigration that people are sort of realizing actually, and also, you know, after years of identity politics, mostly from the left, that people are sort of saying, well, okay, well, what's my identity?
Jess Gill, founder of the Women's Safety Initiative, on the horrific murder of Iryna Zarutska in North Carolina, and why the liberal left don't seem to care about violence against women when it's committed by ethnic minorities.
There are so many paid activists, paid lawyers, and their whole agenda pretty much is to let black people off the hook, ethnic minorities off the hook, because in this very critical race theory Marxist agenda, black people cannot be seen as the victor, as the villains. You know, they are only the victims.
And for our premium subscribers, I speak to Dr. Tilak Doshi, the Daily Sceptic's energy editor, on how Europe's indebted social democracies simply can no longer afford net zero.
So things are getting pretty close to the edge with respect to their economic situation. One of the greatest wonderments of analysts looking into this is the sheer ideological attachment that elites in Europe have for net zero.
Immigration is the global political issue of the day, not least in the Anglosphere. Here in Britain, Reform UK has taken a commanding lead in the polls as the small boats keep coming and following the disastrous Boris wave of migration. In America, President Trump is pursuing a campaign of mass deportations after Biden threw open the southern border. But what about our Antipodean cousins down in Australia? Well, to discuss that today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Jordan H. Knight, who is a commentator and writer and the director of Migration Watch Australia. Welcome to The Sceptic, Jordan.
Thank you, Laurie. Good to be here.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So one of the things that I think is striking about Australian politics, especially when I follow it sometimes through your Twitter feed, is that it actually seems very, very similar to the kinds of debates that we're having here. But I suppose one of the differences that, in fact, you've mentioned today, that we're recording this in the Telegraph here in Britain, is that Australia hasn't really had that much of a populist pushback against this. Well, until now, until this weekend. So there have actually been protests about it this weekend in Australia and across the country. I mean, Jordan, what's going on there?
Yeah, certainly. So Australia, I think for a long time has kind of been held up as being like a multicultural immigration success story. I think even on the right, like Nigel Farage, people like Boris Johnson have even sort of said, you know, we want a point-style system similar to Australia's because, you know, Australia's been so successful. We've even had like previous prime ministers like Malcolm Turnbull from the Liberal Party sort of say Australia is the most successful multicultural country in the world. And there was this sort of prevailing narrative for the last 10 to 20 years that immigration into Australia just worked and that things were hunky-dory and everything was fine. Everything was basically fine up until about the last 48 hours. So in the last 48 hours on Sunday, we had these marches that were pretty explicitly anti-immigration marches, very patriotic, a lot of Australian flags. There were, you know, rather extreme elements in there and fringe elements as there always are, but largely they were mostly sort of mums and dads, mainstream Australians, calling out for an end to immigration. And so, yeah, that really blew apart this narrative of the last 20 years that immigration into Australia was working. These people really stood up and said, actually, it's not working. It's broken.
Yeah, okay, so there's been that political consensus on it. But of course, Australia, like Britain, has seen this massive surge in immigration recently, or over the past few decades as well, but in particular recently. And so you're the director of Migration Watch Australia. You'll be very up on the figures here. How large has Australia's post-COVID immigration wave been?
Australia's migration system been? Yeah, it's... Australia's actually had fairly high immigration for the last 20 years. So even like when they were saying that immigration works, it was almost because people were surprised that it was working so well. I mean, we're bringing in between 100,000 to 200,000 for the last 10 to 15 years, basically since John Howard, Prime Minister John Howard from the Liberal Party came in, I think in 2007. Our numbers have been in the sort of low hundreds of thousands. And that means that we've been growing the population by about 1 to 2% every single year, primarily through immigration. And so just in the last few years, basically since COVID, this has just exploded into 500,000 net immigration. In 2023, our gross numbers were about 737,000. So we've had the Labor government in since, I think, 2022 or thereabouts. And they've just won re-election this year. And so probably by the time of the next election, next federal election, there'll be around 2 million new migrants in Australia. So for a population of 27 million, that is a huge amount. So it's really ramped up in the last few years, and this has created a housing crisis. This has pushed homelessness higher. Real wages are back to 2008 levels. It's on a per capita basis. I think Australia is probably one of the highest, one of the countries with the highest net immigration intakes in the entire world. And this is just completely broken things apart. It's broken the media consensus apart. It's really sort of really pushed and really changed politics in the last couple of years, but also in the last, 48 hours. And now we're sort of just finding our feet. We're basically in this brand new world, right, politically in Australia, where immigration politics, populist politics, like we've seen in Europe and like we've seen in Britain, is now coming down under. And everybody's in a mad scramble trying to figure out what to do about that.
That's interesting. So here, our post-COVID wave, which is widely known as the Boris wave, is now widely considered to be a major mistake, and where we basically liberalised the rules in various ways and then didn't rein them in anywhere near quickly enough afterwards. But if there is a rationale given for it, we generally get something like, well, there were labour market frictions and, we couldn't stack the shelves and things like this. What were the justifications for it, if any, for that massive surge in Australia?
Yeah, certainly. So I can actually pinpoint exactly where it all sort of started, which was the Skills Summit, which came after the pandemic. So during the pandemic, a lot of workers went home. A lot of migrants and temporary workers and temporary students went home. And so businesses were crying out for workers. And this was actually a fantastic time, especially to be a young person in Australia, because speaking for myself and my friends and people I know, but the data reflects it as well, our rents went down, our wages went up, the job market opened up for us. So this was, in a funny way, the pandemic, economically speaking, was fairly good for young people. I mean, house prices exploded, but that's for various other reasons, money printing and all sorts of things like that, government programs. But so after the pandemic, when the borders reopened, there was a skills summit in Australia. And this was basically a meeting between all of the big business and industry organizations and leaders, political leaders from across Labor and Liberal Party, our left and right wing. They all got into a 2 or 3 day conference. And basically the message after that was, open the floodgates. We need as many people in here as possible. There's a skills shortage, they said, a quote unquote skills shortage, which basically just meant wages were rising too fast. And so after that, that's when we really ramped up immigration. Following the skills summit, that's when we brought in 737,000 migrants in 1 year. And the rationale never really stuck. It never really made sense. There was multiple flying around at the same time. They were saying there was a skills shortage, which is bizarre because simultaneously we have world-class universities where so many international students want to come here, and yet we simultaneously have a skills shortage. None of it really made sense. But, the Australians sort of, as this sort of meme goes, Australians are fairly laid back, and that does apply to politics too. There was a certain level of apathy, I think, in the political sort of public. Everyone was just tired from COVID. And nobody really cared too much about, the borders reopening. But yeah, then fairly soon after that, rents started skyrocketing. We had a cost of living crisis driven primarily from rents, house prices as well. And so people were really questioning, well, is this skill shortage narrative true? Do we really need this many? And I think, on the weekend we saw that completely shatter that narrative. So
yeah, and so just tell us a bit more about the nature of those protests then. I mean, what was the distribution of it? Who was protesting? And what kind of signs and rhetoric would have been seen?
Yeah, so it basically started from one single TikTok. So actually what was the sort of what was the impetus for it was that there's been, likewise in Britain as well, we've had constant weekly pro-Palestinian protests and marches. And we had one that went across the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and at that protest, an Australian flag was burned. A video was uploaded. A lot of people were quite angry. And so in response, some 18-year-old, I think in South Australia, made a video saying, "Hey, let's march. Let's start a protest." I think he quickly it went viral, and I think that 18-year-old sort of quickly checked out of that and realized that this was getting bigger than him. But what happened was a few organizers, grassroots organizers, picked up sort of the organization and the planning for that, and just created a few flyers, created a website, and by the end of it, there were protests for August 31st, not just in capital cities, but right across Australia, in small towns like Cairns and Townsville, Mackay. A lot of places had these marches, and this is really unheard of, especially at a grassroots level. Like, Australians are fairly politically apathetic, so the fact that this happened really sort of shows how big an issue immigration was. So on the day, I like to think that I have a good understanding and thought of, can see what was going to happen. I had no idea what was going to happen. And when I went and had a look, and it was one of the biggest protests I've ever seen in my entire life. It was absolutely huge. There was a sea of Australian flags, and I think it really surprised a lot of people. Like I said at the start, there were obviously some fringe elements from the far right. There was representation from, I think they're called the National Socialist Network or something like that. And in Melbourne, they were sort of scuffling with counter-protesters. But by and large, this was just the mums and dads and young Australians sort of thing. And it was fairly sort of above board in terms of rhetoric. There wasn't, it wasn't like tradesmen calling for mass deportations or anything like that. They just simply wanted to cut immigration. And if you spoke to them and you heard their talking points, it was for basically basic economic reasons. So housing, they felt like they were social cohesion was being strained. So fairly sort of above board sort of talking points were sort of, used throughout.
So obviously there's a lot of sentiment there. There's a lot of feeling about this that perhaps hasn't been expressed politically by either side. Where do you think that will go now? Are there leaders looking to take this cause further?
That's the big question. I think that's the question on everybody's lips. Like I said, there's really been nothing like this in Australia since maybe the Voice, referendum a few years ago. But, this was a far more even grassroots sort of campaign. So, unlike Britain, this is what I wrote in my piece on the Telegraph today. Unlike Britain, we don't really have a reform. We have a few sort of national populist parties, but they don't really have the momentum of reform. And the Liberal Party as well seems to be unwilling to sort of take up the sort of mantle of being sort of the anti-immigration, pro-worker populist party. And so there's all this energy and there's all this anger, and nobody yet has really picked up, the crown from the gutter, so to speak. There's no real sort of figurehead trying to channel this energy, of all this anti-immigration sentiment. So where will it go? We're in like unknown territory here. We don't really know where this is going to go. There's constant talk about new parties being started. There's constant talk about like a few sort of Robert Jenrick sort of MPs who are sort of like straying from the party line and sticking up, for workers and stuff like that. But as yet, it's incredibly unclear. I mean, this is murky waters for Australia. It could really go anywhere. We don't really know.
Okay, so in terms of the politics of it then, you've mentioned housing in particular and the difficulty of getting on the housing ladder and the question of can people get high enough paying jobs, and so these material economic concerns. But here in Britain, there are also cultural concerns that are really front and centre in the debate. I mean, particularly we've had the issue of the racially motivated grooming gangs really come into the national consciousness recently. But I mean, you mentioned, for instance, the burning of the Australian flags as well. And so, I mean, clearly there are some cultural issues there as well. I mean, have you had those problems, and is that in the debate?
There's definitely questions about culture from the protesters and from people who are upset about mass immigration. In terms of, you asked about sort of where people are coming from. I think just recently our predominant migrant group just flipped, or is about to flip, from British migrants to Indian migrants. So there's been a total surge from India largely. And this is for the most part, this kind of work, but just in the last couple of years, there's been questions about how this sort of impacts culture, and people are sort of talking about, do they share similar etiquettes in terms of, even just things like public transport, how businesses are run, stuff like that. There is starting to emerge this sort of clashing and headbutting on sort of culture, and I think that as well comes down to numbers, because when you have such huge numbers as we have had, it's extraordinarily difficult to assimilate people into our culture and basically how we do things. As Mark Krikorian says, in the US, the best immigration policy is low and slow, so people can come in and they can really sort of absorb the way things are done. And I think Australians are feeling like that isn't happening. That people are coming in and they're just bringing their culture with them. But there is, on the flip side as well, there's this a level of cultural aggression, I think, which is coming from some elements, largely, in Western Sydney and the suburbs of Melbourne, where people, especially, and this is highlighted by the pro-Palestinian marches, is that people are sort of attacking not just Australian values, but also, they see it as part of this American and English sort of Anglosphere, this post-colonial sort of country. There's this funny merging between, left-wing talking points and this cultural aggression that's coming out of this sort of pro-Palestine movement with people from, Lebanon and, different countries like, in the Middle East. There's this merging of left-wing and sort of, cultural sort of antagonism. And so, we are seeing that in this, in a very sort of subdued way in terms of, Palestinian flags. If you go out to Western Sydney, which has a really high foreign-born percentage, you'll just see, Palestinian flags flying from train stations and things like that. And they do, there are also sort of pro-Palestinian convoys that sort of come out of Western Sydney and sort of antagonize and sort of drive into areas with high Jewish populations and high Australian populations and stuff like that. So there is the occasional sort of, fist fight and violent clash. Mostly it's this sort of strange, I think somebody once referred to it as sort of like psychological warfare. There is this subliminal sort of cultural simmering tension that's starting to emerge in these cities like Sydney and Melbourne.
Well, it's certainly been interesting here how for a lot of centre-right commentators who didn't necessarily want to talk very much about immigration, after October the 7th, after those attacks, and you had it in Australia as well, but these mass pro-Gaza protests across Western cities, and suddenly people realised that there were these mass ethnic blocs in many of these cities who actually had a very different opinion to the mainstream Brit about Israel and other things. And I suppose, was that a particular incident in Australia which kind of turned up the heat and made people notice perhaps the incompatibility of certain cultures?
In recent memory, yes. What happened on October 7th and, the sort of ongoing protests and the reaction to the protests really did sort of signal a sort of vibe shift in the Australian electorate. A lot of Australians, I think, sort of realised actually not everything is as it sort of seems, and actually maybe integration and assimilation isn't working as well as we thought. There's also this sort of fracturing politically as well, where we're finding out, I think Australians are starting to realise that a large number of migrants are voting very differently to what they are. So there was recently sort of this article done, I've written a little bit about it as well, where a pollster sort of found out, or he said online in an interview, that 85% of Indian migrants end up voting Labor when they become citizens. And so that is quite a stark difference, especially when they have, I think there's around 800,000 Indian migrants in Australia. So that can really swing votes. And so people are starting to realize that the migration situation and the foreign-born population that we have in Australia today over the last few years is starkly different to the one that they grew up with in the early 2000s and in the late 20th century. They're realizing actually this is two different things. This is a matter of mass immigration, whereas in the late 20th century it was probably more just regular immigration where elements were assimilating. So yeah, I think this has been the last couple of years has been a major wake up call on the problem of immigration. Yeah.
And so you mentioned briefly the voice referendum there, and I think that struck many of us who observed it in Britain as almost a rerun of the Brexit vote, where you had these cultural tensions between a very liberal political media elite on the one hand and trying to really tell the proles how to vote, and then actually the median voter really just telling them to get lost. And so, well, just can you tell us a bit about what happened there for those of us who don't know? But also, I mean, do you think that prefigured some of the tensions that are going on now?
Yeah, very possibly. It showed that Australia and the Australian populace was completely out of step with what the Australian media and the political class actually thought it was. You know, if you watched what politicians were saying and what the media said for the last 10 years, you would think that Australia, and you're a conservative, you would think that Australia is an extremely progressive, left-leaning sort of society. So the voice to Parliament was basically it was going to be a sort of, you know, a different tier of government that, you know, they wanted to have Indigenous representation at a democratic and parliamentary level. And so it was going to, you know, the arguments on the no side was that it was going to put race into the constitution, effectively. They wanted to sort of, the left was saying that, you know, Indigenous people wanted to have representation, but the people against it were saying that this was going to be extraordinarily divisive and it was going to divide people on race. And so we went to a referendum. It was one of the promises of the Albanese campaign, that they wanted to have a referendum on the voice. And for the entirety of the campaign, much like Brexit as well, the entire business community was on the side of the voice to Parliament, the entire media class, you know, the political class as well, from all sides, both left and right, were on the side of the voice to Parliament. And instead, what we got was, I think, a 60% pretty resounding no against the voice to Parliament. And so that was a strong rebuff to, you know, what everyone thought would happen. And let's be clear as well, there was, you know, far more money on the yes side to that. So that in a way was a sort of soft Brexit, in that it showed that, you know, the Australian sort of mainstream was very much different to what the political and elite media class had been talking about and saying. And in a way, it does prefigure what is happening today, which is, you know, for a long time, the elite media consensus has been that immigration is a good thing. They keep saying that diversity is our strength. They've said the same thing. But this, again, is completely out of step with what most mainstream Australians are saying. And nobody has really sort of figured out how to capitalize and what to do with that sort of 60% vote in the voice. But I think we're going to sort of see more of this sort of divergence between the elite, sort of left-leaning progressive media and political class and the mainstream Australians. And that is just going to that division will likely keep growing, because nothing really seems to be getting fixed.
So that certainly does seem to be a similarity between Britain and Australia, you know, a more liberal left political media class and actually a more conservative electorate. And of course, the post-COVID surge in immigration and immigration policy more broadly is something we've seen a lot of similarity in across the Anglosphere. I mean, there's been a massive amount in Canada. Obviously, things are turning around a bit now in America, but you know, similar in New Zealand and Ireland as well. But what do you think it is about the Anglosphere in particular that perhaps predisposes our countries to take these, well, reckless policies on immigration?
I mean, that's a fundamental question of, you know, how we got here and why are we like this? And I don't think it's necessarily been completely answered. Part of me feels like it comes from a moral supremacy that is kind of prevalent in Western European societies. I feel like it also comes from this sort of old way of thinking, where actually everything is fine, and actually our society, our institutions are so strong, and our people are so happy and healthy and wealthy that we can actually be very extraordinarily charitable to you know, the rest of the world. Whereas, you know, that is just simply not the case. And I think, you know, people like Donald Trump, you know, proved that things like what's happening with Brexit and in Europe is sort of proving that actually people, it's why the catch cry, just put America first is so strong. It's because people feel like they've been put second to these more sort of fantasies and progressive ideals. I'm not sure why it's happening. I mean, Canada as well is going through exactly the same problems as Britain and Australia, and New Zealand as well is also having its same problems. Part of me feels like this is, history doesn't really repeat, but there are patterns, right? And I do feel like we're in this post-industrial sort of stage, and these cycles, people are sort of capitalism is kind of running out of ways to prove its own worth. There's no real sort of there's not much more alpha sort of left in these in the economy, and so we're as these societies, we're now just relying on immigration to prop up GDP, prop up house prices, which is effectively a Ponzi scheme. So it all feels a little bit late stage. It feels like there is one era, which is kind of coming to an end, and we're now sort of at this new historical era with people like Donald Trump and this national populist rise. I don't, what is it? What does that look like? It's impossible to say.
And I would say that one thing that's intimately bound up with that culturally is that with the rise of the post-COVID wave is the BLM mania we had at that time, and this very strident woke politics, which is basically saying that being against immigration broadly at all is very taboo and even racist. And I mean, very much we know that the Conservative Party in Britain has been very afraid of that charge, and that's partly explained some of its policies. So do you think the fact that, well, obviously Donald Trump is massively breaking these taboos by actually following through with mass deportations and everything else, and really we are more broadly moving away from that strident woke culture of the early 2020s, does that open a space to be more forthright and national populist, as you say?
Absolutely. I think I just spent some time over in America doing the Populist Fellowship at Claremont, and just spending time with Americans. The difference in rhetoric from younger Americans and conservatives versus what I've seen in Australia, and from when I spent some time in the UK as well, is that America is just such a more dynamic place politically and economically. The Overton window has shifted so much further than sort of we have here. Are they leading the way? I mean, I'm somewhat terrified that America is really the only place that has this sort of willpower to do that to such an extent. A question to me is, does there need to be, multiple Donald Trump sort of events in each of our countries, or do we just somewhat do as we have done in the past and kind of slowly follow the new sort of Donald Trump era? Do we just kind of do what they do and sort of talk about mass deportations and talk about remigration, which is what they're talking about? And are we just going to follow suit, or will we each have to have our own Donald Trump moment? It's hard to say.
And of course, the similarity there between Anglosphere countries is, well, they're all essentially English, British diaspora settler nations, and certainly what they were when they were founded. And we in Britain have been having this debate about whether you can talk about Englishness as an ethnicity or not, or certainly on the right at least. And so to what extent is that debate going on in Australia, and how do you feel about the significance of being part of the global Anglo diaspora?
Yeah, I think that was one of the narratives that have kind of just recently been questioned and sort of smashed apart in Australia. I think for a long time, for like as much as, when I was growing up in Australia, we had this very sort of one world, one people sort of sentiment, and that we're all the same and things like that. And it's only really in the last few years of mass immigration that people are sort of realizing actually, and also, after years of identity politics, mostly from the left, that people are sort of saying, well, okay, well, what's my identity? And people are now sort of having the identity question of what it is an Australian. There was speeches during the marches on the weekend arguing basically, Australian is an Anglo-Celtic people predominantly. That doesn't mean that, of course, we can bring in new elements, especially from Europe who are sort of, great cultural fits, and also from, other places in the world too, if they're willing to sort of subscribe to the Anglo sort of Celtic sort of tradition and identity and institutions that sort of have been built in Australia. And I think, yeah, people are sort of realizing that actually the way that things are done, such as democracy, such as, free speech and all of these sort of, things that we brought, from England and from Britain, and Europe and Western civilization, didn't just come out of nowhere. Actually, there's a historical reason that, Australians have these things. And I think what we saw on the weekend is that people recognize this and they want to hold on to these things. And in fact, they're proud of them and they want to promote, Australia's British and Celtic and European identity. That doesn't necessarily mean to exclude people, but it just means, actually, people would argue that, this is Australia did start as an English, British, and sort of Irish, nation that had certain institutions and ways of doing things, and people just wish to preserve that.
I suppose that leads me on to my final question then. If it is a peculiarly Anglo disease to have these reckless experiments in immigration, does that nevertheless suggest that it's also within the capacity of these societies to find the cure to it and actually to say, no, we know we have these pretensions to universalism all the time. They're very inherent in our way of thinking, really. But actually, we need to remember that we are a people. We are a particular society. And we can't lose sight of that. And in fact, if we do, we might actually not have our wonderfully universalistic society anymore.
Yeah, I think, universalism is exactly what it is that it is one of the best things about, I think, the British and European sort of way of thinking is its openness to other people in the world and things like that. But you're right as well that it's a double-edged sword and that it could be worked against us. I think, will the Anglo countries have it within them to sort of maybe temper their universalism if it did get them into this place? I mean, America does have the dynamism and just the will to sort of question these old sort of taboos and these old myths. Whether Australia does and whether England does and Canada and things like that, it comes down to a matter of willpower, I think. Are we strong enough to face the harsh realities that we can't be a home to the entire world and just have continued mass immigration forever? Will we actually have to put our own nation and our own cultural values first? Do we have the strength to do that? Now, I'm meeting lots of young people, especially young people, who do have that willpower and who do have that sort of that assertion in their pride of their country and their background and their values and things like that. And this is why I think it's probably the same in Britain as well, is that any sort of quote unquote new right movement will be driven by the energy and motivation of younger people as well, who actually want probably the country that and the living standards and the economy that their parents enjoyed, and they basically want to preserve and go back to that.
Well, I think this interview has left me hopeful. Jordan Knight, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Now, supposedly, liberal feminism is all about putting the interests of women first. So why do so many liberal and left-wing feminists seem eager to dismiss or ignore crimes against women when they're committed by ethnic minorities? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Jess Gill, who is a commentator and the founder of the Women's Safety Initiative. Welcome to The Sceptic, Jess.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Yes, good to have you back. We were having a similar conversation last year, but that's since you've actually founded that initiative, which is very exciting. We'll get into that more. But there is a really just horrific story we do have to get into first this week, which I did really want to get your views on, and that's this awful murder in Charlotte, North Carolina in America, of this Ukrainian woman, a young woman refugee, in fact, from the war in Ukraine. And as many people will have seen, she sits down on a bus somewhere in North Carolina, and there's this man behind her by the name of DeCarlos Brown Jr., and he gets up and stabs her in the neck, and she bleeds out in the bus. And it is this absolutely horrifying scene. Well, Jess, I suppose, what is your initial reaction to it? But I suppose in particular, there's been almost a deafening silence, partly from American media outlets like the New York Times for a long time, and over here in Britain, for example, the BBC. They've taken a very long time to even pay any attention to what really should be headline news, one would think.
Yeah, it's absolutely heartbreaking to see. I mean, this Ukrainian woman just goes and sits down in front of a black man, and she's just minding her own business. And then all of a sudden, he just goes and stabs her multiple times on the neck, making her bleed out. It's really heartbreaking in the first few seconds after it happens. She's so confused, she's scared, she's so alone, and no one's there to help her. Everyone's I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I think they probably, are in shock too. But nevertheless, they should have helped her, and she did die alone and scared and crying. From what we can tell, I think there was audio sound with it. She wasn't screaming or anything, which you would think would be, the initial thing. It was just so sad. It was it was heartbreaking, the fact that she just cried, unable to do anything about it, probably knowing that it's her last moments alive on this planet. It's heartbreaking to see, and the fact that no one did anything about it until minutes later, it just shows how much of an atomized society it is. And I think as well, I think the racial aspect is important to reference, because the left has made it an issue over the past few decades. I mean, the man was arrested, I believe it was 14 times, obviously a repeated behaviour. And there are so many paid activists, paid lawyers, and their whole agenda pretty much is to let black people off the hook, ethnic minorities off the hook, because in this very critical race theory Marxist agenda, black people cannot be seen as as the villains. They are only the victims. Look at George Floyd. I mean, everything that George Floyd stood for, that he represented, that he was made to represent, police defunding, letting black criminals off the hook, these could have helped this poor Ukrainian woman, and these led to her death. This led to her death, and I think that does need to be noted. And at the same time, while the institutions are supporting black criminals, which also just doesn't help the black community whatsoever. I don't think it's good if you're a tax-paying, hard-working African American. You don't want to be represented by that. I think that's also awful. But at the same time, when you think about white women in this country and in America and in several other Western nations which have been impacted by this, throughout our lives, we have been told that we have white privilege, that if we see the stereotype is that it's just a very urbanized black man, and the woman clutches her purse as he gets on the lift, which the reality isn't that. I don't think it's, the colour of his skin, it's how he's presenting himself. And there are quite a few, I think it's African Americans are 12 times more likely to kill white people than the other way around, I believe it is. There is a problem within the black community, and I think that is just a matter of fact. And throughout our lives as white women, we've been told that if you acknowledge that, if you want to take necessary precautions, nothing hateful, nothing bigoted, but maybe if a man is obviously on drugs, if he's looking mentally unwell, like the man behind her was, if he's looking a bit dodgy or sketchy, your natural instinct should be not to sit by him. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this position, because when I was growing up, and this was a very small town in England, you could go out wearing whatever, not looking behind you at any point. As a teenager, you could go out at 10, 11, and your parents would have no worry about it. And now there are only a few places in this country, and similarly in other Western nations, where that's the case. And it's because of this agenda, and it's because of mass immigration, it's because of this push for diversity that ignores that ignores the reality of it. And I think it's just harmful overall. It's harmful towards the victims. It's harmful towards the ethnic minority communities who are, tax-paying model citizens. And that is probably the majority of them, I'd like to say. They don't want to be represented by that. And it's also making them unsafe as well. Like, black on black crime is so prevalent in America. And these critical race laws are just upholding that. So overall, it's just exacerbated the issue since George Floyd, and now we've seen the results of that in such a horrific case.
And I think one of the things that's quite perplexing, quite unfair about the narrative here is that, well, I think, as you say, it's right to note the racial dynamic here because it is relevant. And of course, partly one of the reasons we know that's important in a way is that the left tell us it's important all the time. For instance, you mentioned George Floyd. It's simply because there was a white cop and a black man that was assumed to be this horrible racist murder. And all the time we are told that race has to be brought into things with, hate crime laws, for instance, in Britain. And yet in this particular case, as you've remarked on online as well, the criminal in question did specifically say, I got that white girl. So he brought it into that. He clearly is thinking in this way. And so it's a bit rich for the left, who are always saying we must notice race, to now suddenly say, oh no, we must be totally colorblind and not bring that into it at all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the reality is that we have. I think society has become, we've gone away from this colourblind meritocracy, and that is mostly because of the left. Look at diversity hires. That's just a standard thing with affirmative action. Look at, DEI. Look at all these departments that are specifically for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, which pretty much is anti-white. There's no two ways about it. I think there is a conversation to be had about treating, minorities right. I think racism against minorities obviously does exist, and that's wrong as well. But the answer to that is not racism towards white people, but that's the path that we've gone down. I think the majority of the people speaking about this, whether it's this case in America, whether it's Emily Jones, the 7-year-old who was murdered by the Albanian woman, whether it's a Southport stabbing, many cases like that, so whether it was back in the day with the Ariana Grande concert, that was bombed by an Islamic terrorist, killed several young girls. Every single time that happens, the majority of the people speaking out, of course there are going to be a few bad eggs, but the majority of the people speaking out are just simple people who are concerned, standard people who are concerned with what's going on in their country, the safety of their wives, their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. They're the ones speaking out against it. Same with the Epping protests, where women are actually leading the forefront with this, with the pink ladies. The reality is that the people speaking out against this, they're not these, far-right bigots, they're not these racists. Most of them would say, they have to preface everything with, I'm not racist, but... and then go on to say something that's very standard, that no one in a civilized society would have to say that it's racist. I'm not racist, but I don't want illegal immigrants, making my daughter feel unsafe. Why would that be racist to begin with? But because the left has, made this narrative so prevalent and made us feel guilty for simply speaking out against women's safety, they feel like they have to, when in reality we should be more at the forefront of this conversation. We shouldn't be apologetic about it. I think, obviously racism is awful against anyone. No one is denying that. But I think the reality is that there are many people who feel that mass immigration has impacted women's safety. And they aren't, again, like I said, they're normal people. They're concerned mothers, they're concerned fathers, brothers, sisters, who simply want a safer country and also don't want an extreme level of immigration. They don't want no immigration. They just want, the people coming into this country vetted. They want them, to abide by the law, and they want them to come into this country legally. And I don't think that's asking too much. So the idea is... So the idea that, there's this far-right scary narrative is just so silly to me. And at the same time, as we noted with George Floyd, the fiery but peaceful protest, it's, it's just ridiculous. When you want to talk about extremism, I think you just need to look at the summer of George Floyd to see who the actual extremists are.
I think it's important, as you say, to explain this in terms of political choices that have been made that have led to this. And we could talk about the immigration situation in Britain, but just to cast our mind back to this particular case as well. I mean, you mentioned it a bit earlier, but there are explicit policies like cashless bail, for instance, or bail for just $500 for a person like this who, let's remember, has had 14 convictions for various violent offences. So this is one way this has been described as basically in America you get one murder free if you're a lunatic, and frankly if you're black as well. That is relevant here because in many of these Democrat-controlled areas, these are explicit policies that are talked about in terms of racial justice and reparations and things like this, and that is therefore seen as the reason why someone like DeCarlos Brown Jr. Has to be out on the streets. And so one shouldn't forget, therefore, whether it's in this case or whether it's someone being sexually assaulted in Epping, these are downstream of political choices that the people in power have made.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no two ways about it. I think when you think about how policies, especially even if they're not specific about race, just about policing, for example, about justice, about law, it is massively against white people and white victims. There are so many NGOs, there are so many, activists, lawyers, willing to give a lot more sympathy towards people who do not deserve sympathy on the basis of race. And this is happening in this country as well. For example, with the grooming gang victims, a lot of these victims are still waiting to receive justice. They're still in hiding, a lot of them. They still have to be very cautious about what they do on a day-to-day basis because they're worried about getting attacked. I've spoken to a few of them, actually. And what they have to go through. It's not just that it happened when they were young, it's carried with them all their lives. There have been so many opportunities for the authorities to help these women throughout their lives, and they've just not. They've given them minimal help, and they've had to wait until it's too late a lot of the time. And then they say, oh, well, we couldn't have known, community tensions, they make their excuses, austerity even, they say, and it's just not good enough. And then at the same time, again, the reason why these Pakistani grooming gangs, for example, were ignored was because of a worry about community tensions, and that's just not a crackpot's conspiracy. It was mentioned in the J report, for example, and in several other reports as too. This isn't just us coming out of nowhere saying it. It's been backed up by the evidence pretty much. And we've seen over the past few years in particular, although I would argue going back to stuff like the Equality Act in the UK and in America the Civil Rights Act, which again, I think has some merit to it. However, it has been taken too far to some extent, and has allowed anti-white racism, both in the justice system and also in the workplace as well. And I think it makes sense that people are annoyed at this. And what happened in America to this poor Ukrainian girl, I think when I saw that video, I just thought it really summed up the situation in the West, where you can just be going about your business, not even, not that it is a reason, you should be able to wear what you want, but she was dressed, very, modestly because she looked like she was going to the gym or something, I don't know. She had a cap on, you couldn't even see her face. She wasn't doing anything, she didn't even interact with the man. Even if you do something like that, you're still, at risk of being a victim. And it speaks to me in particular because there have been instances on the tube where I have seen people display antisocial behaviour, and I've even documented that on Twitter, for example, and then people have been like, oh, what about his point of view, he's homeless, you shouldn't be saying this stuff. It's like, no, you need to uphold this standard, and if you're willing to break this social convention, what else are you, willing to do? It's broken window theory. And I've seen situations on the tube where a woman, for example, there was a man who was black. Obviously, he might have been homeless, I'm not too sure. It was in the middle of the day. He was sleeping on the tube. He had his arms and legs spread out a bit, but there was enough space for a woman to sit next to him. And this obviously middle class woman, scooted herself, moved her body to sit on this seat on this very busy tube. And I remember she she looked at the guy like across from her, who was like checking on her, like to see if she's okay. And she pointed to the guy next to her and she was like, oh, bless him. And then as soon as that seat, another seat was free, she quickly moved to that next seat. So it is virtue signaling, but at the same time, you know, again, if someone is displaying antisocial behaviours, I think that is, you know, you do have a right to acknowledge that and be cautious of that too. But because we're taught to, you know, have this extreme empathy at the expense of ourselves and our own safety, it is putting us at risk. But no one's willing to say that. So when I saw this video, I just saw so many examples of my life and, you know, of my friends' lives where we've, you know, acknowledged these things and, you know, been told to look the other way or been told to not acknowledge these situations. And then that's the price of it.
Indeed. And so you've been told to look the other way. You don't want to. You think that's not right. You're going to take a stand against this. And so, well, you founded the Women's Safety Initiative. So I guess tell us a bit how that came about and how much, what have you been up to these past 3 or 4 months?
Yeah, I think I actually spoke about starting something like this on this show actually last time, which is crazy. So basically I started the Women's Safety Initiative. Since moving to London, I moved to London last year. I've left now, thank God. But it was literally every single time I'd go out, something would happen. Not the most extreme things. Like, I'm not saying anyone assaulted me or anything. That just didn't happen. But it was small, again, like antisocial behaviours. People would say like weird things to me. They'd make weird comments at me. On the first week, every time I'd go outside, something would happen. Someone called me a whore. Somebody like followed me, I can't remember what happened that specific week, but there was one thing after another. And so I just documented that on Twitter. And a lot of people, you know, they related to that, they empathized. But at the same time, a lot of people like, oh, you're lying. And it's like, well, if I was lying, I would make something more interesting up. Like, this is just so random. You know, I'm just simply documenting what's happening. And the fact that they think I'm lying when this is just a normal like reality to me. You know, it happened when I was living in Reading as well. You know, so many places in the UK are experiencing stuff like this, and this is just a norm for women. So I kept on reporting it, and I think people were really interested by that. And also, you know, more women spoke out against it because I was speaking out about it, and it led somewhat of a trend with that. And then I spoke to like my friend Anna McGovern, who is the deputy director of WSI, and she told me that she had an experience where she was grabbed by a man when she was walking home from work, and she luckily ran away, but she reported it to the police, and it turned out several other women had experienced this. Luckily, they were able to catch it on CCTV, but it took over 2 years for him to be deported. And when you think about those 2 years, 2 years probably, you know, wasting taxpayer money, 2 years of him potentially being a threat. And I guarantee, you know, he'd been doing that for a few months at least. And when you see these trends, it's very hard to ignore, and especially when you consider that so many people have ignored it. I mean, I'm sure we might talk about it, but there have been 100, you know, women's groups who have said that, you know, people who talk about women's safety and immigration are putting women's rights at risk. The Observer actually did a hit piece on us about that. But these same people have ignored the grooming gangs for the past few decades. You know, they're willing to turn a blind eye to the most awful thing happening in this country. So I don't think they have a right to lecture us about that. When, you know, I'm hearing stories of women being gang raped, you know, from the age of, 12, impregnated, and they don't know who the father is, and we're actually making a difference about it when the authorities have failed. We only exist because they failed. And they've made it an issue of ethnicity as well by, ignoring it because of community tensions. So I don't think they have a right to say to us that we're pushing back women's rights when we're simply representing the victims. So that's the reason why I started the Women's Safety Initiative. Again, it's because I experienced it myself and I wanted to raise awareness about it, and I was surprised that no one was really raising awareness of it. And I don't want to claim too much credit, but I think it did spark a lot more people to talk about it since WSI was formed. Not that I want the credit as well. I think if people are talking about it, that's my mission completed. So I'm glad it started a national campaign because again, like, how can you say that mass immigration is good and these men should, come in this country in the hundreds of thousands, if not sometimes millions, when they come from countries which, they hate women. They have no women's rights. Femicide is high in a lot of these countries. FGM is prevalent. And I think that speaks to, the type of people we're bringing over here. Places aren't made by the land, by the environment. They're made by the people in those areas. And if you bring enough of those people here, especially, unvetted, especially when you're not like seriously thinking like, do they want to integrate into this country? Are they going to benefit? Or are they here just to, benefit themselves? Which seems to be a lot of the cases. And when you go to areas like Whitechapel, there are some areas in Birmingham like this, in Leicester, even in Manchester and Newcastle. It is just, there are no white people. It's, all the signs are in foreign languages. You wouldn't be able to tell that it is England, and it's not. And then you have to wonder, like, why are they here to begin with? But also in these areas as well, like, as a woman, I don't feel comfortable, wearing, basic, British clothing. I don't feel comfortable wearing, a skirt that's knee length or wearing, a relatively low cut top. And I know that might sound, a bit silly, but, these are things that British women have been able to do for so long. And I think, I don't want us to regress to a point where just because you wear a certain clothing means you're treated a certain way. And these are just standard things. Wearing a summer dress even, you're made to feel like you shouldn't and that you should cover up. And I don't think that should be normal. And since starting the WSI, the Women's Safety Initiative, we've received so many messages from women. So many members have supported us. I think we're on 700 members now, so we're going strong with that.
Yeah, so very encouraging. And clearly a key objective of the WSI is raising awareness of this issue in general, and as you say, gaining membership and attention and things. But I suppose if you were to crystallize it, what would be the key political demand that the WSI is wanting to achieve?
So I think realistically now, I don't have much hope that the Labour government will do anything about it. Like that's just a reality. So, even though I think we should try and get as many people on the side of mass deportations, for illegal immigrants, and also I think sex offenders, and also people coming into this country from countries which just hate women, I think there should be very, very strong vetting of that. And I think these are just standards. I don't think that's going to happen, and especially not in the next 5 years. I think it needs to happen, but the reality is it just won't. I think WSI should more so be about listening to victims. These women, they've not been, they've been ignored for so long. And it's not just grooming gang victims as well. It's also, just women who have been attacked randomly. The stories we hear, it's just heartbreaking, honestly. And it's for every walk of life as well. It's, you have patients, going for like sexual reproductive care, and they have a doctor, or not a doctor, he's probably just like a healthcare worker, helping with their case. And they've received discrimination because, what they're seeking doesn't align with, the views of this man. And again, I think these views probably come from the country where he's from. And in the same way, you have doctors and nurses, women doctors and nurses, also facing discrimination. Because, again, I reckon it's because of these people come from countries which don't respect women. So they have to face harassment. They have to face anti-white racism as well because of that. So it's just heartbreaking to see. And I think more people just need to be made aware that, for one, this is an issue, and two, it's okay to talk about this issue. And I think we have to talk about this issue because otherwise it's just going to continue. Otherwise, more girls will be raped, more girls will be groomed, more girls will be murdered, more women and girls will be murdered. And that's just the reality of it. And if it comes to, whether it's the option of being polite and ignoring the truth, the reality is that it's either that or we're going to, we're going to have this issue continuing. And I'd rather not have this issue continuing. So that's the price we have to pay. So it's about turning public opinion and also raising awareness of it pretty much while supporting victims.
And just so finally, Jess, what is your message to those liberal feminists who sent that letter? You mentioned it earlier, but denouncing the idea of protecting women coming from right-wingers as a far-right dog whistle and everything else. What do you say to those types?
It's a tough one. For part of me doesn't really care about what they think because they are in the minority. They are the extremists, and polling has showed that. I mean, we did a poll recently showing that I think it was in terms of deporting sex offenders, there was an overwhelming amount of support from the British public for that. I think it was like 87. And then the biggest majority after that was the not sure parts, which again is ground we can win. Only 3% actually had an issue with that. 3%, like, they are the smallest minority. They are the extreme opinion, and I don't want them to be weighted in the same way that, we are. Like, I don't think that's the reality. We do hold the majority opinion. But the thing is, like, I think these women, when they say, oh, you're weaponizing, women's safety and all that stuff, we're putting in the effort to speak to victims. We're putting in the effort to fundraise. We're going to be holding a grooming gang conference to, put the victims first. That's not going to be political at all. Sorry, just dying there. It's just going to be about the victims and their families and the support around it. This has never been done before. And we're prioritising victims. And if that annoys them, if they hear a story of people protesting a girl being sexually assaulted and they're more annoyed at the protesters, I think they're the issue. And I don't think they're worth, arguing with or debating with. I think we should just show them to the most people and say, look, these people are evil. Like, there's no two ways about it. They are evil. If you want to ignore the systemic grooming of hundreds of thousands of girls in this country, you are evil, and I think they need to be treated as such.
Indeed. Well, Jess Gill, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, Europe's stagnant social democracies are approaching massive fiscal crises as their welfare spending balloons. But will that also prompt a rethink of their welfare programs for green barons, the net zero agenda? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Tilak Doshi, who's the Daily Sceptic's energy editor. Welcome, Tilak.
Great to be here, Laurie.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So, well, before we get into the net zero agenda here and how this is impacting the fiscal situation of Europe's social democracies, I suppose let's talk first about the actual welfare crisis that they're in. Now, obviously, to a large extent, this has been caused by lockdown, but, really, and there's also demographic problems in terms of having too many old people, essentially. But why are they in such a hole fiscally already?
I think it's culmination of a series of events. As you mentioned, COVID played a particular role in it. But since then, a number of what we could call own goals. I mean, continued and unopposed mass migration, which has made the burden of the welfare state even more extreme. There's been the issue of supporting with great financial resources the Ukraine war. And to top it off, and we are going into the second big decade of this, major investments and policy supports and mandates for the net zero program. So this have come together with the crisis of the Ukraine war and its impact on the energy situation in Europe. We see it coming to some kind of a crescendo over the past few weeks when the German Chancellor himself said that the German welfare state was not sustainable. And there were reports in both French and UK newspapers about how both these countries were on the verge of potentially needing a bailout from the IMF. So things are getting pretty close to the edge with respect to their economic situation. And we are talking of, a slowdown, a fall off in the rate of productivity growth, and recessionary situation in all these three economies for the last couple of years. So it's no surprise, or one would think, that these issues are coming to the fore now, being debated in the mass media. And finally, to top it off, the final, I would say, indicator of how far gone this economic.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.